A racist white cop humiliates a black man in court, thinking he's powerless, until a call from the White House stops everything. What happens next shocks the entire courtroom. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse loomed large, their weight a symbol of the burden carried by those seeking justice. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the polished floors. The air was thick with the hushed whispers of attorneys, clerks, and anxious defendants awaiting their fate. But for Marcus Wright, the oppressive atmosphere wasn't just about the court. It was about what it represented. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his deep brown eyes steady despite the storm raging inside him. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, Marcus looked every bit the professional he was. Yet, as a black man, he knew all too well that appearances meant little in a world quick to judge him by his skin before his credentials. Marcus, a civil rights attorney, had come to represent a young black father, Dante Hughes, a man falsely accused of assaulting a white store owner. The evidence in Dante's favor was overwhelming, but that had never stopped the system before. Marcus had fought too many battles like this to believe justice was ever guaranteed. And then came Officer Travis Caldwell, a hardened white cop with a history of excessive force. Caldwell had been lurking near the entrance, his ice blue eyes scanning the room like a predator assessing its prey. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming, but there was something about the way he carried himself, the unchecked arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Marcus barely had time to settle his briefcase when Caldwell approached him, his hand already resting near his holster. "You don't belong here," Caldwell sneered, his voice laced with a slow-burning hostility. The room quieted. A few heads turned, but no one intervened. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression calm. "Excuse me. I said you don't belong here," Caldwell repeated, stepping closer, his imposing frame nearly nose to nose with Marcus. "This isn't your kind of courtroom." Marcus felt the heat rise in his chest, a familiar mix of anger and exhaustion. He had seen this scene play out too many times before, but never in a place where the law was supposed to be blind, fair, and just. He had spent years fighting for people like Dante, people the system discarded, overlooked, or outright targeted. And now, he was being treated like a criminal himself. His hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained level. "I'm here representing my client, officer. Step aside." Caldwell let out a cold, condescending chuckle. "Not anymore, you're not." And then, before Marcus could react, Caldwell grabbed his arm, tight. A collective gasp rippled through the room. A white cop, physically removing a black lawyer from the courtroom. The racial overtones were impossible to ignore, yet no one stepped in. Fear hung in the air, thick and stifling. Marcus's voice cut through it. "Let." Mr. Go Caldwell smirked, leaning in. "Make me." For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "They will always try to silence you, but never let them." And just as the tension reached a breaking point, a phone rang. Loud, sharp, piercing through the courtroom silence. The bailiff, a middle-aged black woman who had seen enough injustice to last a lifetime, reached for the line. Her voice trembled slightly as she answered. "Yes, this is courtroom 4A. Her eyes widened. Her hand tightened around the receiver. She looked straight at Caldwell, her lips parting in disbelief. And then, in a voice that shook the entire room, she announced, "Officer Caldwell, put your hands off that man. The White House is on the line." The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. For a split second, the entire room stood frozen. The only sound was the distant echo of a judge's gavel slamming in another courtroom. Officer Caldwell's grip on Marcus's arm tightened, but the smirk on his face faltered. The White House. The bailiff swallowed hard, her gaze flicking between the phone and the officer. "Did you hear me, Officer Caldwell? The White House is calling." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others whispered in hushed disbelief. A call from the most powerful office in the country? For him? Caldwell's bravado cracked. His fingers twitched against Marcus's sleeve before he let go. Reluctantly, but he let go. For the first time, his confidence wavered. Marcus stepped back, adjusting the sleeve of his suit with calculated calm. His pulse pounded, but he wouldn't let them see his anger. He had won the first battle. The judge, a stern-looking man who had been watching the scene unfold from his bench, finally spoke. Who exactly is calling from the White House? The bailiff hesitated. Then, as if steadying herself, she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. It's the Chief Counsel's office. They're demanding to speak to Marcus Wright, right now. The murmur turned into a full-blown wave of gasps. Marcus didn't flinch. Of course, they were calling. He had friends in places Officer Caldwell could never dream of. Connections he rarely pulled. But today, he made sure they knew exactly what was happening. Caldwell's face was a portrait of rage and disbelief. His jaw clenched so hard, the muscle twitched beneath his pale skin. He had thought he was untouchable. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Wright, you're free to take the call in my chambers. But Marcus, he wasn't moving just yet. His dark eyes flicked to Caldwell, who was still standing there, fists at his sides, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. And then, with quiet authority, Marcus spoke. Not so fast. Before I go, I'd like to hear Officer Caldwell explain to this courtroom exactly why he thought he could put his hands on me. Caldwell stiffened. His lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Marcus tilted his head. Go on, officer. Tell them. I'll wait. The weight of accountability had just shifted, and the entire courtroom felt it. Caldwell wasn't the one in control anymore. The real fight? It was just beginning. A thick, suffocating silence hung in the courtroom. All eyes were on Officer Caldwell, his face now a mask of humiliation and barely concealed rage. The very man he had tried to publicly disgrace was now standing before him, untouchable, backed by the most powerful office in the country. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. He wasn't leaving that courtroom until Caldwell answered for what he had just done. The officer shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twitched at his side, as if itching for a weapon that wasn't there. He was used to being the one in control, used to people lowering their gaze, backing down. But Marcus wasn't afraid of him. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, his patience wearing thin. Well, officer, Mr. Wright has asked you a question. Caldwell's eyes darted toward the judge, then back to Marcus. He had two options. Speak, or walk out, looking like a coward. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, he was being forced to justify his own actions. I was just doing my job, Caldwell muttered, but the confidence was gone. Marcus's lips curled into a humorless smile. Your job. He stepped forward, voice unwavering. Tell me, Officer Caldwell, which part of your job requires you to assault an attorney in open court? Another murmur rippled through the crowd. A woman in the back scoffed. A man near the front shook his head. The tide was turning. Caldwell clenched his jaw. I thought... He stopped himself. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You thought what? You thought I was just another black man who didn't belong. The words weren't spoken, but they might as well have been carved into the courtroom walls. Caldwell's silence spoke louder than any excuse he could have given. Judge Whitman sighed deeply, rubbing his temple, as if he knew what had to come next, but didn't want to admit it. Officer Caldwell, he said, his tone edged with irritation. Step back, now. Caldwell hesitated, his feet rooted in place. Marcus tilted his head. I said, I'll wait, but I won't wait forever. A vein pulsed in Caldwell's forehead. He had lost. With one final glare, he took a step back. His hands clenched into fists, his entire body radiating anger, embarrassment, and, most importantly, fear. The courtroom wasn't his domain anymore. And Marcus wasn't done yet. Now, Your Honor, he said smoothly, turning to the judge as if the entire exchange had been a mere inconvenience. Shall we proceed with my client's case, or do I need to take another call? The judge stiffened, because everyone in that room knew what Marcus was really saying. Make the right decision, or the next call will have even bigger consequences. Judge Whitman straightened in his seat and cleared his throat, flipping through the case files with renewed urgency. He knew he had no choice but to handle things carefully now. Marcus had just changed the entire trajectory of that courtroom. And Officer Caldwell? His reckoning had only begun. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, but the weight in the room was undeniable. Power had shifted. Officer Caldwell, still standing rigid, looked like a man teetering on the edge of an explosion. His pride, his authority, had been ripped from him in front of an entire courtroom. The very people he had lorded over for years were now staring at him with something he wasn't used to seeing. Doubt. Marcus stood firm, calm, composed. But his mere presence was a declaration, a warning that things would never be the same again. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses and sighed deeply. He flipped through his notes, his fingers twitching slightly. The courtroom was no longer under his full control either, and that fact sat heavy on his shoulders. "Mr. Wright," the judge finally said, his voice more careful now, "you're here to represent Mr. Hughes. Let's proceed with his case." Marcus nodded, smoothing the cuffs of his suit. "Gladly, Your Honor." But before he could say another word, the courtroom doors burst open. Two men in black suits strode in, their expressions unreadable. Their presence alone sent a shockwave through the courtroom. They didn't need to announce who they were. The aura of federal authority spoke for itself. Caldwell stiffened. His face paled. One of the men, a tall, sharp-featured agent, stepped forward and pulled out his badge. Special Agent Carter, Department of Justice. His voice was steady, clipped, and filled with purpose. His eyes landed directly on Caldwell. Marcus didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He already knew what was happening. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses again, feigning ignorance. "Agents, what's the meaning of this?" Special Agent Carter didn't so much as blink. "We're here for Officer Caldwell." The reaction was immediate. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Caldwell's breath hitched. His hands twitched at his sides. His bravado, the unchecked arrogance he had worn like armor, was gone. "You can't be serious," Caldwell muttered, but his voice betrayed his panic. The second agent stepped forward, his presence just as imposing. "We're investigating multiple allegations of civil rights violations," he stated bluntly. "Officer Caldwell is required for questioning." Required for questioning. The words carried more weight than an arrest, because this wasn't just about today. This was about every case, every abuse of power, every injustice Caldwell thought would stay buried. Marcus turned now, slowly, his gaze settling on the man who had tried to humiliate him. "Looks like you're the one who doesn't belong here, officer." The room fell dead silent. Caldwell's chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind scrambling for a way out. He turned to Judge Whitman, as if the judge could somehow save him. But for the first time, there was no lifeline. Judge Whitman didn't move, didn't speak. His hands were tied, and he knew it. Marcus folded his arms, letting the moment stretch, letting Caldwell feel the weight of his own downfall. And then, the words that sealed his fate. "Officer Caldwell," Special Agent Carter said, his voice steel. "Please come with us." Caldwell's breath shuddered. His legs didn't move. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Marcus took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough for only Caldwell to hear. "I told you. You put your hands on the wrong man." A flicker of something flashed in Caldwell's eyes. Regret, fear, reality finally catching up. But it didn't matter anymore, because his reign was over. The agents grabbed his arms, and as Officer Travis Caldwell was escorted out of the courtroom, the people he had once intimidated watched in silence, some with shock, some with satisfaction, but all knowing one thing for certain: justice was finally coming. The heavy doors slammed shut behind Officer Caldwell, but the echoes of his downfall lingered in the courtroom. Marcus stood tall, unmoved, watching as the man who had tried to disgrace him was now being led away like a criminal himself. A poetic irony. The room was still tense, but the energy had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to hope. Judge Whitman, visibly unsettled, shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat and forced his voice into a tone of authority, though it lacked its usual force. "Well, now that this interruption is over, let's return to the case at hand." Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of everything still settling in his chest. He had walked into this courtroom prepared for a fight, but even he hadn't expected the powerful turn of events. But he wasn't finished. He turned back toward the bench, his gaze locking with Judge Whitman's. "Your Honor, I believe we should address what just happened before we proceed." The judge stiffened. He didn't want this conversation. He wanted to move past it, erase it from the day's record. Marcus wasn't about to let that happen. Officer Caldwell's actions today weren't just an interruption. Marcus continued, his voice steady. They were an abuse of power, an attempt to intimidate and silence me. The crowd murmured again, a new ripple of unease washing over the room. Marcus stepped forward. "And I have to ask, how many others has he done this to? How many have been denied justice because men like him are given unchecked authority in this very courtroom?" Judge Whitman's jaw tightened. His gavel hovered in his grip, his knuckles white. This wasn't supposed to happen. Marcus wasn't supposed to have the floor. But Marcus did have the floor. And now, everyone was listening. The young black man sitting at the defendant's table, Dante Hughes, the man Marcus had come to defend, looked up at him with something close to admiration. Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all of them. The judge cleared his throat again, obviously desperate to regain control. Mr. Wright, this court is not here to discuss Officer Caldwell's behavior. That is a matter for internal review. Marcus smirked slightly. Internal review. The same system that had protected Caldwell for years. Marcus let the judge's words hang in the air, let the emptiness of them sink in. Then, after a deliberate pause, he spoke. Then let the record reflect that today, in this courtroom, power was held accountable. Let it reflect that the law does not exist to protect those who abuse it, but to defend those it was meant to serve. A slow nod of agreement from a woman sitting in the back. A barely concealed smile from a young public defender. Even the jury shifted in their seats, suddenly more aware of the weight of this case. Judge Whitman looked down at his bench. He knew what Marcus was doing. And worse, he knew Marcus was right. The judge exhaled sharply. Fine, let's move forward. Marcus took a breath and turned back to Dante, offering him a reassuring nod. His real fight was about to begin. And this time, the courtroom was watching. Marcus could feel it. The tension in the air had shifted. The entire courtroom, from the judge to the jury to the spectators, was seeing things differently now. For so long, people like Officer Caldwell had operated without consequence. His type of justice was swift, merciless, and often aimed at the wrong people. But now, the script had flipped, and for once, it was Caldwell answering to the law, and that meant the system was paying attention. Marcus turned back to his client, Dante Hughes, the young black father who had been falsely accused of assault. Dante sat there, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He had been silent through most of the morning, watching in quiet shock and disbelief as Marcus had taken on an entire courtroom, and won. But his fight wasn't over. Marcus straightened his tie and addressed the judge. Your Honor, let's get back to the real reason we're here today. He placed his hands firmly on the defense table. The wrongful charges against my client. The prosecutor, a graying, middle-aged white man named Stephen Reynolds, stood with a sigh. He looked rattled. And why wouldn't he be? The day hadn't gone remotely how he'd expected. Mr. Wright, Reynolds started, his voice thin. We're prepared to argue our case, but given recent developments, I'd like to request a recess. Marcus smirked. He knew exactly what Reynolds wanted, a break, a chance to regroup, re-strategize, and try to salvage what was left of his weak case. Not happening. Marcus shook his head. Request denied. His voice was firm, cutting through the tension. This case has already gone on too long. My client has been dragged through this system for months, based on nothing but an accusation. Let's finish this. Right now. The judge hesitated. Marcus could see the wheels turning in his head. Judge Whitman was a man who liked order. He wanted control over his courtroom. But Marcus had forced the judge into a position where ignoring the truth would make him complicit. Finally, the judge sighed heavily. Proceed, Mr. Reynolds. The prosecutor looked uneasy. He wasn't expecting to be forced into trial today. Still, he nodded stiffly and walked toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, the evidence will show that Mr. Hughes entered the store, engaged in a verbal altercation with the store owner, and then physically assaulted him before attempting to flee. Marcus could almost laugh. There was no real evidence, just a story, one that conveniently fit a pattern society was far too comfortable believing. Marcus leaned toward Dante and whispered, Stay steady. They're bluffing. Dante nodded once, but his hands still shook. Marcus turned to the jury, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp. Now it was his turn. He stepped forward, letting the weight of the morning settle before he spoke. The prosecution wants you to believe a lie, he began. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a slow-building storm. They want you to believe, without a single shred of real evidence, that my client is guilty. Marcus gestured toward Dante. Mr. Hughes is a father, a husband, A hard-working man who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He turned back to the jury. And that's all it takes sometimes, isn't it? For men like him. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus knew exactly what he was doing. They needed to feel the discomfort. They needed to sit in it. He walked to the evidence table, lifting the police report the prosecution had submitted. He held it up for the jury to see. Let's talk about what the state is calling evidence. His voice was controlled, but there was fire behind every word. He flipped the paper over. It was blank. The jury leaned forward slightly. Marcus continued, his voice deadly calm. No surveillance footage, no DNA, no witnesses. Just a statement from a store owner who had a problem with a black man in his shop. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Marcus turned to Judge Whitman, his eyes unflinching. Your Honor, at this time, the defense moves to dismiss this case due to complete lack of evidence. A stunned hush fell over the room. The judge looked at the prosecutor. Mr. Reynolds? Reynolds hesitated. His jaw clenched. He wanted to fight back, but there was nothing left to argue. Finally, he cleared his throat and mumbled, "The state has no objections." A gasp rippled through the spectators. Dante sucked in a sharp breath, his hands covering his mouth in disbelief. His nightmare was finally over. Judge Whitman sighed heavily. Very well. Case dismissed. Marcus let out a slow breath. Victory. But before he could even turn to Dante, something happened that neither of them expected. A slow, steady clapping began from the back of the courtroom. Then another. Then another. Within moments, half the spectators were standing, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Because this wasn't just about Dante. This was about every case like his. Every black man who had been falsely accused. Every injustice that had been swept under the rug. And for the first time in a long time, justice had won. Marcus turned to Dante, his voice low. Go home to your family, man. You're free. Dante's face crumpled, overwhelmed with emotion. Thank you, he whispered. Marcus squeezed his shoulder, then turned back toward the exit. The weight of the day settled on his chest. The fight wasn't over, not even close. But today was a damn good start. The courtroom buzzed with energy. Even though the case had been dismissed, no one seemed eager to leave. Something historic had just happened here, and everyone present knew they had just witnessed the kind of justice that rarely came for people like Dante Hughes. Marcus let out a long breath as he collected his briefcase. He had won, but the fight wasn't over. Dante was finally free. But what about the countless others who weren't? The ones who had been railroaded, silenced, thrown behind bars because they didn't have someone to fight for them. His victory wasn't just for Dante. It was a message, and people were listening. From the corner of his eye, Marcus caught Judge Whitman, still seated at his bench, rubbing his temple like a man who had just realized he'd been a part of a broken system all along. Good. Let him sit with that. Marcus was just about to leave when a familiar voice called out behind him. Mr. Wright. He turned to see Special Agent Carter, the DOJ officer who had taken Caldwell into custody, approaching with his partner. Marcus crossed his arms. Agent Carter. Carter nodded, glancing around before speaking in a lowered voice. You made waves today. People upstairs are watching. Marcus arched an eyebrow. Good. They should be. Carter studied him for a moment before continuing. Caldwell isn't just facing internal discipline. The White House is considering launching a full-scale investigation into civil rights violations committed under his watch. A sharp, satisfied exhale left Marcus's lips. About time. Carter smirked. And if that happens, they're going to need the right people leading the charge. Something in his tone made Marcus narrow his eyes. What are you saying? Carter exchanged a glance with his partner before answering. I'm saying you might be getting a call soon, Mr. Wright. Marcus stiffened. A call. From the highest level of justice in the country. Before he could respond, Carter leaned in slightly. Be ready. This fight isn't over. With that, the agents left, disappearing through the courtroom doors as if they had never been there at all. But their words lingered. Marcus stood still, heart pounding. A call from the White House. A chance to take this fight national. This wasn't just one case anymore. This was about changing the entire system. Dante suddenly appeared beside him, shaking his head in disbelief. Man, I still don't believe this is real. His voice wavered, eyes glassy with relief. I get to go home, Marcus. Because of you. Marcus turned to face him fully. You get to go home because you were innocent. I just made sure people saw it. Dante swallowed hard, nodding. I owe you. Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder. No, you don't. Just live your life. Be there for your kid. That's the only thing that matters. Dante blinked back tears, giving a final nod before heading toward his family, who was waiting at the back of the courtroom with open arms. Marcus exhaled, his hands tightening into fists. He had spent years fighting cases like this, winning some, losing too many. But now the White House was watching. Now, he had a chance to rewrite the rules entirely, and he was damn sure going to take it. The cool evening air greeted Marcus as he stepped outside the courthouse, the weight of the day still pressing against his chest. The city lights flickered against the darkening sky, and a soft breeze rustled the edges of his suit jacket. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. Dante Hughes was free. Officer Caldwell was facing consequences. The entire system had been forced to watch as justice, real justice, was served. But Marcus knew better than to celebrate too soon. One victory didn't change a broken system. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He already knew who it was before he pulled it out. Unknown caller. He hesitated. Then, with a slow exhale, he answered. This is Wright. A deep, authoritative voice came through the line. Mr. Wright, this is Thomas Keller from the White House counsel's office. Marcus stopped walking. His grip on the phone tightened. It was real. We've been following today's events closely, Keller continued. You made an impression. Marcus's jaw clenched. I wasn't trying to make an impression. I was trying to do my job. A pause. Then a knowing chuckle. That's exactly why we're calling. Marcus stayed silent, waiting, listening. We need people like you. Mr. Wright Keller's voice was even, steady. People who don't just talk about justice but make it happen. Marcus stared at the ground, his mind racing. They weren't just offering him recognition. They were offering him a seat at the table, a chance to change things at the highest level. We'd like you to come to D.C., Keller finally said. There are conversations happening that you need to be a part of. The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. This was it. The moment where he had to decide what kind of fight he was ready for. He glanced back at the courthouse, at the place where he had just battled for one man's freedom. How many others needed that same fight? How many stories just like Dante's were buried under corruption, bias, and unchecked power? Marcus took a slow breath, and then, with quiet resolve, he answered, Tell me when and where. The line went dead, but Marcus didn't need a response, because he already knew. This was just the beginning.